everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we are getting started on Dave's SRT-4, and as you guys saw, the first thing that I am doing is some of the foundational work for the intercooler tubes, and I'm working on the intake manifold itself. So I cut the old throttle body flange off, and now I'm working on installing this one right here. And Dave's new throttle body is right there. And what I am doing right now is figuring out the cuts and the forming and everything else that I need to do to make the throttle body fit by the radiator fan right here. As you can see, it's kind of tight confines, but I think I should be able to make it work. So I made the initial cut. I made it parallel or on plane with the old throttle body flange, which is right here. So I cut this off, and I went ahead and tried to fit the new flange and everything up on here. And if I can get my big dumb hand in here. So I took the new flange in here, put it on here, and we're close but not quite there, because by the time the throttle body goes on here, it will still come down and hit the radiator fan. So what I need to do is essentially take the intake manifold back off and miter cut this tube stub that comes off of the plenum. If I make a cut at an angle to kick everything back towards the engine, then I think that will provide the clearance that I need to make all of this fit and to make all of this work. After a little bit of persuasion and tailoring, Dave now has a throttle body on his intake manifold. So I left enough clearance for the throttle cam to clear the plenum. There is enough space on this side for him to put his TPS in place, and this puts us at a pretty reasonable angle to build the intercooler tubes. So the only thing left to do now, as far as this throttle body flange conversion goes, is to weld the flange to the actual intake manifold itself. And then that portion will be done, and I can start figuring out how to fasten the throttle cable in place, as obviously the cable will need to run from this hole right here along the side of the head, and I'll more than likely make use of these two threaded holes on the head. And then I'll put a little mounting tab on the bottom of the intake manifold, so that way the cable will be housed appropriately, and we don't have to worry about the cable flopping around and getting into any of the other components. So in addition to that, there is one port on the bottom side of the intake manifold that needs to be converted to 8th NPT as well. And I believe that Dave included a bung for this somewhere in here. Yeah, there's one 8th NPT bung there, and I'll more than likely have to get a second one. Actually, it isn't even more than likely. I will need to get a second one, because I need to put a port for a coolant pressure sensor somewhere in the radiator as well. But since we're focusing on the intake manifold now, we'll get that squared away and get the throttle cable stuff squared away. Dave's intake manifold is now modified, the new throttle body is on it, and I'm at the point where I can figure out how to mount the throttle cable. So, looking at it from the top side, there is clearance to the fan, The flange is welded solid to the rest of the intake manifold. Again, not really anything has changed down here, but my outlet angle for the throttle body is still good. I'll still be able to run a tube down through there. And I also went ahead and put the little 1/8 NPT bung, which you guys can't see right now, but it's on the bottom side of the plenum down under there. So that way he can use it for whatever sensor or reference line or what have you that he needs to. So the intake manifold's done, aside from a little bracket to hold the throttle cable. And I'll have to figure out, I need to retain this cable to the cylinder head, like I said earlier, probably using these two holes on the side of the head right there. And then this cable sheath will kind of snake around, so I end up with as straight of an angle to the throttle cam, or straight of an angle from the throttle cam to the throttle cable as I can possibly have. So that way we kind of alleviate, or help alleviate as much as possible, the cable jumping off of the throttle cam or potentially compromising the cable or something along those lines. To go along with the new throttle body setup on Dave's intake manifold, he now has a new throttle cable bracket. So I measured out the height that I needed to get the cable in a good location to actually hook up to the throttle cam, and I aligned the actual receiver hole for the throttle cable to the throttle cam, and everything fits well on this, and it'll make building the throttle cable very easy. So the intake manifold at this point in time is done. All the modifications I needed to do to it are all completed. Everything is squared away, and at this point in time I can put all of this back on the car and start actually making the throttle cable for it, or making it fit, I should say. Dave's throttle cable is now securely fastened in the engine bay, and everything is going well on that front. So this is what we ended up with. And the last thing that I built in this video was this little bracket right here. So like I said earlier, I went ahead and used the two threaded holes on the side of the head. I made this kind of cool, or interestingly shaped bracket, and put a couple of riv nuts in, a couple of P-clamps. Now this is very solid on this side here. On the actual intake manifold side, you can see the little end on it right there, and the cable is fastened into the throttle cam. Our bracket is on the bottom side of the intake manifold right in there. Right there. You can see the end of the cable, the attachment point for the cable right there, and everything is good to go with it aside from the actual cabin side. So on the cabin side we have this. And I'm being very, very careful with this thing to not scratch anything, not cause any issues. I'll actually take my knife out of my pocket for right this moment. But right there is the gas pedal, and you can see the end of the cable right there that Dave modified to use this factory little plastic clip deal right there. So that clip goes into this eyelet on the pedal, and obviously our length on the cable is not correct right now. I still need to trim that down, but I'll fasten that onto there, get all that squared away, and then I just ordered some body plugs that I'll probably just end up sandwiching the body plug in between these other clamp deals, or this other fastener assembly on the cable right here. That'll hold it securely on the firewall, and then at that point in time the cable will be completed. To wrap up Dave's intake manifold work, I need to get the throttle cable mounted. So it's mounted on the engine bay side via this plate that we just built earlier in the video, and now I need to get it mounted to the firewall. So I went ahead and I ordered a body plug, firewall plug assortment, and what I'm going to do is use this, punch a hole in it, and use this to retain the backside of the cable here that will actually mount on the firewall and get it to hold in place that way. So shouldn't be that big of a deal. And then I'll have to take this side of the cable, the throttle body side, trim it down, trim the cable down, all of that to get it the appropriate length so we don't have an excess of cable kind of draped around the engine bay somewhere looking unsightly. Dave is now the proud owner of a functional throttle cable assembly. So I got the cable sheath trimmed down, I got the cable all hooked up and tightened down and everything else. And if we go on the inside of the car now, and if you guys can hear, you can hear the throttle body moving as well. So the gas pedal, the throttle linkage, throttle cable, all of that is squared away and everything's out of the way. We have our little grommet up on the firewall there, and pretty happy with the way that all of that came out. But for right now, we're actually going to do a little welding experiment. So these two pieces of tubing right here are two pieces of 321 stainless tube. As you can see with my beautiful chicken scratch on both of them. And what we're going to do is a little back-to-back welding experiment. So in these tubes right here, we have 347 stainless filler rod, which is the correct filler rod to use for 321 stainless welding. And if you can see that right there, this is 35,000th filler rod, or 35,000th diameter. Now conversely, what I typically use is 347 still, but 45,000 thick. And believe me, that extra 10,000ths of an inch makes a difference when you're welding thinner wall tubing. So what we're going to do is a back-to-back weld experiment, weld study, and kind of a proof of concept with the two filler rod diameters. So I'll take these pieces and I'll cut a section off of each of them, prep the joints, prep the surfaces, do all of that. And I want to see what the welds look like back to back, both for my sake and to show you guys. And then we'll talk about proper filler rod selection and why it truly does matter. Over at the welding bench, I now have everything set up for our little welding experiment. So starting with the pieces of filler rod, the closest one to me right here is the 035 rod, and this one right here is the 045 rod. So hopefully you guys can see the diameter difference right there. And it's amazing how much of a difference 10 thousandths makes, even to just looking at it with your bare eyes. So these are our two little test pieces, and if you guys noticed, I also went through and I did a full prep regimen on them, and I think that's very important when you're doing any test welds or test pieces for a couple of reasons. Now, A, it helps you set up a joint that is the same way that it would be if you were putting this into an actual header or whatever piece you're working on. And B, it helps you practice and work on your prep skills. So right here, this was to practice bevels. This was 4 pieces that, or 4 practice bevels rather. It was 4 pieces that I got to practice putting a surface finish on. And the more reps that you have with those things, the better that you're going to end up being with them. So repetition is key, and it's very important, in my mind at least, to have as many reps as you possibly can. So I also went ahead and I back purged the tack welds. So if you can see on the inside there, there's no nasty oxidation or anything, just 4 clean little tacks on each of them to hold these pieces together perfectly. And to do that, and what I'm going to use to purge these as I am doing my test welds, again, back to the principle of practice the way that you actually work, we're using TIG Aesthetics purge plugs. Now, my buddy Brad runs this company along with my friends over at Tycon, and these things make purging much easier than the old foil method. So they come in all different sizes. You can see my box here with all the different assorted sizes in there. And with these being 2-inch tubes, I'm going to go ahead and use the corresponding purge plugs. This one here is the vent plug. You can see that it just has a little vent tube sticking out of it. This one is the feed side, which I just ram one of my quick disconnect purge fittings that came with my SPW purge kit into here. And you can see it has a little diffuser screen on the bottom to get better argon coverage on the inside of the workpiece. So, with all of that being said, and hopefully that wasn't too wordy and hopefully you guys got something from it, let's go ahead now and start doing our test welds. With the 2 test welds now completed, let's go ahead and compare and contrast and talk about some notes and so on and so forth. So, this tube you can see is the 035 filler, this is the 045 filler. And if we compare the 2 welds, we can see that the 045 weld, may be difficult to see on camera, is just a little bit wider than the 035 weld. But if we look through, you can see that the heat affected zone, which is a quickly referenceable way to see that, is how wide kind of the burned area around the outside of the weld is. And that on the 035 filler is significantly smaller than the 045 filler. So what that means in actual practice is there is less heat being put into the parent material or the pieces that you are welding together. Now, why does this matter? Well, the more heat that you put into a piece and the wider that heat affected zone is, the piece is inherently more brittle, or the area right around the weld is. So the weld itself will be very strong, but the heat affected zone will be a little bit weakened just due to the heat that you're applying to it and melting the metal together. So the smaller you can make that heat affected zone, the more longevity you can expect out of the part, and the more resilient the part will be to the use that you are applying to it. So using smaller filler rod, you don't have to use as much heat to melt the filler rod, and therefore You don't have to use as much heat to melt the parent material, melt the filler rod, melt all of that together, as opposed to the larger diameter filler rod where you have to heat it up enough where the tip of it starts to liquefy before you can add it into the actual weld puddle and have it be part of the weld that you're laying down. So beyond the exterior aesthetics and talking about the heat affected zone and everything else, we should look at the inside, or we would be remiss if we did not talk about and look at the inside of these pieces to see what penetration looks like. So again, 045 right there, 035 right there, and if I shine my light on the inside, there you can see the penetration on the 035 filler rod piece, and it is full penetration the whole way around. The 045 piece, also full penetration the whole way around, and the penetration sticks out a little bit more on the 045 filler rod piece, just due to adding more filler rod in, more heat, and so on and so forth. So this is not a detrimental thing, at least not in an automotive application. For something like sanitary stainless work, it will end up equating to more work to sand things down and to prevent any bit of bacteria or anything like that from growing on the inside of the piece that you are welding. But in an automotive sense, having that little filler rod ridge on the inside, or the penetration ridge, I should say, is not the end of the world. So in all actuality, both of these pieces would be perfectly fine to put into service, whether it be a header, a downpipe, wastegate dump tubes, so on and so forth, whatever application you can think of. But from the actual anecdotal standpoint, and what I can say in having ran these two welds and a bunch of other welds with the two different filler rod size options, the narrower or the thinner the wall thickness that you are working with on a particular piece, the thinner the filler rod should be as well. If you use thicker filler rod on thinner materials, then you can end up quenching the puddle or cooling it off, meaning that the filler rod acts as kind of a heat sink to pull heat out of the weld itself. So therefore you end up having to run more heat to achieve a correct weld, and that can be a little bit problematic with the heat affected zone and everything else we talked about earlier. Conversely, the smaller diameter filler rod, you have a little bit more control over what you are doing, just because you're not jamming a huge thick piece of filler rod into the puddle. It's a much more, shall I say, dainty addition of filler rod, and that may not be the right word for it, but you guys, I'm sure, can understand what I'm saying. You're not upsetting the puddle, you're not quenching it or anything else, but to make sure you're applying enough filler rod to it, it takes a little bit of getting used to figure out that balance. So the moral of the story is they're acceptable and fine options. It comes down to the way that you weld and the way that whatever you're used to. For me, I could use either one of these. From now on, since I have a couple pounds of this 035 rod, I'll probably use that for this little bit thinner wall thickness tubing. But for my Schedule 5 schedule pipe that I build all of my manifolds out of, I'll stick to using the 045 rod, as it helps fill a bevel a little bit more, and I can apply and add a little bit more material a little bit more quickly. So with the first portion of Dave's project wrapped up in the form of modified intake, manifold, throttle cable, this whole assembly here that is kind of the foundation and the base to build the rest of everything off of. With that completed, now as soon as the aluminum tubing comes in, then I can get to work on building these intercooler tubes and getting Dave's car well on its way to being wrapped up. But I think we're about out of time for this episode, and frankly, I can't really do anything else with Dave's car until the tubing comes in. So we'll end it off there. And again, absolutely beautiful car. And I feel honored and privileged to have the opportunity to work on it. But with that being said, let's go ahead and wrap this one up, and that way we can look forward to the next one coming at you very shortly. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, for watching all the projects go on here, for working on Dave's car, for all the cool things that are yet to come with this, all the cool things that are yet to come with the Supras behind me over there. And I don't want to say too much right this moment, but this thing may or may not be going on the dyno again in very, very short time. But we're about wrapped up here, and I have a few things to knock out on that car before it goes to the dyno, of course, if it is going to at all. Wink, wink. So, with all that being said, and with a significant portion of Dave's project knocked out, that'll be the end of this one. So, as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.